Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Easy English Spark. I'm so excited you're here today because we're about to embark on a powerful story-driven lesson designed to boost your English listening and speaking skills. Over the next few minutes, you'll hear a 10-chapter journey about a dedicated mentor and a student named Zoe, each chapter revealing new insights into empathy, resilience, and communication. We'll start with Chapter 1, A Seasoned Mentor's Reflection, then move through Zoe's challenges and triumphs all the way to Chapter 10, Empathy and Lasting Change. Get ready to listen closely, pick up natural expressions, and practice speaking along with the story. Let's get started and light up your English journey. Chapter 1, A Seasoned Mentor's Reflection. I am Mr. Thompson, and today I want to take you back to the very start of my life as a teacher. Imagine a cool spring morning, sunlight pouring through tall windows, fresh air drifting in from the open hallway, and the gentle hum of students gathering outside room 204. My own heart was racing with excitement and a touch of nervousness. I was young then, my hair still dark, my face smooth, and I carried with me a stack of worn novels and notebooks that felt almost sacred in my hands. As I stepped across the threshold, the scent of new textbooks and chalk dust filled the air. I arranged my books on the edge of the teacher's desk. Great Expectations, To Kill a Mockingbird, a slim volume of Emily Dickinson's poems, and an anthology of short stories. Each book represented a world I wanted my students to discover. I smoothed my shirt, adjusted my tie, and looked out at a sea of faces, some bright with curiosity, others distant and uncertain. I drew in a deep breath and spoke. Good morning. My name is Mr. Thompson, and I believe that every story we read can open our minds and touch our hearts. That simple introduction marked the beginning of my journey. In those early days, I learned quickly that teaching is not just about sharing information, but about creating connections. I discovered that a single well-placed question could spark a lively discussion, that a kind word of encouragement could give a shy student the courage to speak up, and that listening carefully was as important as explaining clearly. I watched as students leaned forward in their seats when a plot twist in a story surprised them, and as they frowned thoughtfully when grappling with a difficult poem. Among all those eager faces, one student stood out, a girl named Zoe. She sat in the second row, always with her notebook open and her pen poised. Whenever I asked, "What do you think the author means here?" Zoe's hand shot up. She didn't speak just to show she knew the answer. She spoke because she genuinely wanted to understand. She asked why curving sentences in poetry could carry such emotion, how minor characters often reveal deeper truths, and what makes a story resonate long after we close the book. I remember the first time I read one of Zoe's essays. The title was Finding Home in Words, and as I turned each page, I saw that she had given herself completely to her writing. Her introduction began with a question. Have you ever felt lost in a crowded room but found yourself in the pages of a book? She described how books became her refuge, how characters felt like friends, and how language gave her a voice she hadn't heard before. On the margin, I wrote, "Beautiful imagery. Your words paint a picture." And keep asking these questions. You're on the right track. Zoe's enthusiasm was infectious. Other students began to join discussions more readily, partly because they felt inspired by her curiosity. One afternoon, I introduced a poem by Robert Frost, and Zoe asked, "Why did Frost choose the image of a snowy evening to speak about? Loneliness?" That question led us to talk not only about Frost's life, but also about how we all experience moments of feeling alone, even when surrounded by people. In that moment, literature became more than a lesson. It became a mirror, reflecting our own experiences and emotions. Through teaching Zoe and her classmates, I found my own teaching philosophy taking shape. I understood that my role was to guide, not dictate. I learned to ask open-ended questions instead of giving all the answers. I learned to celebrate small victories, like when a student who usually avoided speaking joined a group discussion, or when a struggling reader finished a page without giving up. I learned that patience and empathy are the foundation of any meaningful lesson. Over time, I realized something even more important. Every student carries an untold story. Just as Zoe brought her love of words into the classroom, others carried hopes, fears, and challenges we never saw. Some wore their struggles on their sleeves. Others masked them behind a quiet smile or a closed notebook. As I shared passages from Dickens or discussed themes of justice and kindness, I reminded myself to look beyond grades and attendance. I reminded myself to see each student as a full person with a story worth hearing. Now, with silver threads in my hair and years etched into the lines around my eyes, I look back on those first weeks with gratitude. Teaching Zoe was a gift, not only because she was a remarkable student, but because she taught me the true power of words and the importance of listening to young voices. As I prepare to tell you the rest of Zoe's journey, keep in mind that behind every pen and every quiet glance lies a world waiting to be discovered. And in learning to listen, we learn to teach. Chapter 2. Fading Spark in the Classroom. I remember the morning everything began to change. It was a chilly autumn day, and I walked into room 204 carrying the usual stack of papers to grade. The windows were fogged with the cold, and the chatter of students sounded distant as I set my things down. I glanced around the room, expecting to see the bright faces I had come to know over the semester. But when my eyes fell on Zoe, something felt off. Zoe sat in her usual seat, second row from the front, but today her posture was slumped. Her notebook lay closed on the desk, and her pen rested untouched beside it. Normally, her back would be straight, her hand gripping the pen, ready to jot down every insight. I paused for a moment in the doorway, wondering if I had imagined it. Then the bell rang, and I stepped forward to begin the lesson. "Good morning, everyone," I said, voice warm with greeting. "Today, we'll continue our discussion of Shakespeare's Sonnet 18. Who can remind us what 'Shall I compare thee to a summer's day' suggests about the poem's tone?" I scanned the room, looking for Zoe's eager hand, but she didn't raise it. Instead, a few other students volunteered. As we talked about imagery and metaphor, I stole glances at Zoe. Her eyes were downcast, and she barely looked at the page I had projected on the board. I tried to engage her directly. "Zoe, what do you think about the use of eternal summer in this context?" I asked, pausing beside her desk. She shifted in her seat but did not meet my gaze. Her voice was almost a whisper. "I'm not sure." That single sentence felt heavy in the silent classroom. "That's okay," I said gently. "Take your time. Think about how a summer's warmth feels. Then compare that to what the poet means by eternal." She nodded once, slowly, but didn't open her notebook. Throughout the class, Zoe remained quiet. She didn't ask any follow-up questions, didn't volunteer answers, and when I walked past, she barely looked up. It was as if someone had flipped a switch overnight. I couldn't recall her ever behaving this way. At the end of the period, I collected her worksheet, a half-finished copy with only 2 lines answered. The rest was blank. I slipped it into my grading pile and moved on to the next class, but my mind stayed with Zoe. After school, I sorted through the day's graded papers. Zoe's worksheet weighed on me more than the others. I had always seen her work improve steadily, her confidence grow with every assignment. To see her fall silent felt like watching a candle gutter in the wind. I realized that I was not just puzzled, I was concerned. Word of her change spread quickly among her classmates. At lunch, I overheard 2 students whispering, "Did you see Zoe in class? She didn't say a word." I heard she's upset about something at home. Rumors swirled, but no one knew the truth. By that afternoon, I could no longer ignore it. I decided I needed to understand what was happening. The next morning, I arrived early and waited at the classroom door. As the students filed in, I greeted them one by one. Zoe slipped inside, clutching her bag straps tightly. and sat down without a word. I gave her a small, encouraging smile. She offered a faint nod, but the spark I knew so well was gone. During our discussion of a short story by Edgar Allan Poe, I watched her closely. Whenever I asked a question, her head dipped lower. When other students read aloud passages, Zoe's gaze drifted to the window. Once, I caught her staring at a leaf slowly spiraling down outside, the same leaf she would have described last. Weak with excitement. Now she just watched, silent. After class, I called her over to the desk. "Zoe," I said softly, "I've noticed you seem distracted lately. Is everything all right?" She paused, her hand hovering over her bag. Finally, she looked at me, eyes filled with something I had never seen before, exhaustion mixed with worry. She shook her head slightly and turned away without speaking. I felt a pang of frustration at not knowing how to help her, at my own inability to break through her silence. I wondered if I should push harder or give her space. I decided on the latter. Sometimes simply showing someone you care without demanding answers can make the difference. For the next few days, I continued to call on Zoe gently, offering support rather than pressure. I provided extra time for her to complete tasks and a few encouraging notes in her notebook. "I believe in you. Take your time. I'm here if you need to talk." Each day, she opened that notebook and saw those words, yet she still wrote little. Her eyes remained tired, and her hand shook slightly when she did write. In faculty meetings, I mentioned Zoe's change to the counselor, who suggested that some students face challenges outside school that affect their focus. I realized then how little I knew about my brightest student's life beyond these walls. I resolved to learn more, but in a respectful, caring way. By the end of Chapter 2, I was convinced of two things. First, that Zoe's fading spark was not a sign of laziness, but of a deeper struggle. And second, that my role as her mentor was just beginning. I knew I had to look beyond grades and participation to truly understand what was dimming her light. And so, with a heavy heart but determined spirit, I prepared to follow the trail of clues beyond the classroom walls. Chapter 3: Unease and Silent Observation. I stepped into room 204 just before the bell, careful to make as little noise as possible. The rows of desks were already filled, but the air felt different, thicker, quieter, as though the room were holding its breath. I paused at the door and glanced down the aisle toward Zoe's usual seat. She was there, but she looked smaller somehow, curled around her closed notebook like a bird tucked into its nest. My heart tightened. I moved to the front of the room and placed my gradebook on the desk. I met my students' eyes with a gentle smile, but I could not shake the knot in my chest. Something was wrong with Zoe, and though I did not yet know what it was, I felt a growing urgency to understand. Class began. I introduced our new text, a short story about a traveler finding hope in unexpected places. I spoke in my normal voice, tried to keep my tone as light as possible, but my mind kept drifting back to Zoe. I watched her hands. They rested on the desk, fingers tracing the edge of her notebook. Her pen lay beside them, untouched. Every so often I saw her inhale slowly, as if bracing herself for something I could not name. When I asked for volunteers to read the first paragraph, Zoe did not look up. She stared at the page projected on the board as though it were invisible. Instead, another student, Marcus, read carefully, voice steady. I thanked him and began our discussion, but I kept scanning for any sign from Zoe. A raised hand, a turning of a page, even a glance at her classmates, anything. But there was only stillness. Over the next 40 minutes, I spoke about character motivation and theme, paused to ask questions, and encouraged debate. The students responded, and the room hummed with thoughtful energy, everywhere but at Zoe's desk. Twice I called her name softly. Twice she shrugged and shook her head. I told myself not to push too hard. I tried to focus on the lesson. Yet each time I passed her desk, I saw her eyes focused somewhere beyond these walls. Her shoulders drooped. When the class ended, the students gathered their things and filed out. I waited until nearly everyone had left. Then I walked over to Zoe's desk. She sat exactly where I had left her, as if frozen in time. I knelt beside her chair, gently rested a hand on the back. "Zoe," I said, "you don't have to answer now, but I want you to know I'm here if you need anything." She gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, and then she slipped out without another word. Over the next few days, I turned our classroom into my observation post. I arrived early and hovered at the door, greeting each student as they arrived. I noticed how Zoe walked in, slower than the others, bag slung low, head tilted down. I watched where she put her things. Instead of setting her notebook carefully on the desk, she tucked it into her backpack as if she had no plans to open it. During lessons, I made a point of pausing beside her desk, offering extra time for an answer or a hint when she looked stuck. I wrote notes of encouragement on her handouts. "Take your time. I believe in you. You are not alone." I saw her read them, her eyes flicking to the margin, and then I watched as her gaze drifted back to the desk. No response. No tear, just that same heavy-looking stillness. Outside the classroom, my curiosity and worry grew. I watched at lunch from across the courtyard as Zoe sat alone on a bench. She unzipped her lunchbox, smelled the food, then closed it again without eating. She stared at the sky, and I wondered what she saw there. A future I could not imagine? An escape she could not reach? One afternoon, just before the final bell, I noticed Zoe slip out of class before I dismissed everyone. I called after her, "Zoe, wait!" But she kept walking, shoulders hunched, disappearing down the hallway. I debated following but stopped myself. I wanted to respect her space, yet every second I did not speak to her felt like time lost. After the bell rang, I looked up and down the corridor. She was gone. As evening fell, I left my desk with an uneasy feeling. I walked to the window and looked down at the empty school grounds. I thought of the confident, curious girl who once sat in that seat, notebooks overflowing with questions. I thought of her silent figure now, bent and withdrawn. I realized that what was happening to Zoe was happening to me, too, as a teacher and as a person. I felt her pain as keenly as if it were my own. That night, I could not concentrate on dinner or the evening's newspaper. My mind replayed every moment I had watched her, the way she tapped her pen, the way she avoided my gaze, the way she melted into the chair. I knew I had to find a way to help, but I also knew I could not force her. Trust. I needed more clues, more understanding, and so, with a restless heart, I resolved to keep watching, quietly, respectfully, determined to learn what lay beyond Zoe's silence. For in that silence, I sensed a story unfolding, a story I could not yet read, but one I knew I would not abandon. Chapter 4. An Unexpected Sight. I decided to follow my curiosity that afternoon, even though a small voice in my head warned me to respect Zoe's privacy. I had left school by the back gate, walked down Maple Street, and past the quiet rows of houses where early evening lights were beginning to glow. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of coffee from the cafe on the corner. I paused in front of Sunrise Cafe, a modest place with brick walls and a hand-painted sign. Inside, soft jazz played, and a few customers chatted over steaming mugs. I knew this was the spot where Zoe sometimes worked, though I hadn't thought much of it, until now. I slipped through the side door and moved closer to the counter area, keeping myself hidden behind a tall display of muffins and pastries. There I saw her, Zoe, dressed in the cafe's green apron, carrying a stack of clear plastic cups filled with iced lattes. Her arms trembled slightly under the weight, and I noticed the faint tremor of exhaustion in her shoulders. Each step she took toward the sink made me wince. Her dark hair was pulled back, but a few strands had escaped to frame her pale, drawn face. She set the cups down and began wiping tables, her movements meticulous, yet slow. Every surface she touched seemed to absorb just a little more of her strength. A regular customer greeted her, and she forced a polite smile, but it felt brittle, like a fragile shell crumbling at the edges. She spoke in a low voice I could barely hear, then moved on to stacked chairs at the end of the day's daylight. I watched her lift each chair onto its matching table, one by one, her knuckles white with effort. A sudden pang of guilt hit me. I had imagined her skipping class or wasting time, but here she was, hard at work, literally carrying burdens far heavier than any textbook. I felt anger at myself for misjudging her so harshly. I realized that every time she met my question in class with silence, she was not indifferent to learning. She was preoccupied with worries I could not yet name. As she bent to pick up another cup, I noticed the cafe owner, Mrs. Patel, approach. The two exchanged a few words. Zoe nodded and disappeared into the back room. I seized the moment to step closer and peek through the open door. Inside, mugs were piled in the sink, and the floor was littered with crumbs. Zoe stood before a commercial dishwasher, loading it tray by tray. She paused when she saw me in the doorway, and for a heartbeat her eyes widened in alarm. She wiped her hands on her apron, then turned away as if to hide the fatigue etched on her face. I cleared my throat gently and said, "Zoe?" She froze, then slowly rotated to face me. I looked straight at her, trying to convey all the compassion I felt. "I'm sorry to surprise you. I came because I wanted to understand." Zoe's jaw tightened. She pressed her lips together and looked down at the gleaming stainless steel floor. I hesitated, then continued. "I didn't know you were working here so many hours." My voice cracked in the stillness. "You don't have to answer me now, but may I ask why?" Zoe's eyes became shiny with unshed tears, and I realized how vulnerable she must feel with her secret laid bare. She swallowed hard, and after a long moment said, "I have to help at home." Her words were so small I almost missed them. "My mom, she's not well." She gestured toward the front window where I had seen her mother force a smile at customers earlier. "We don't have enough money. I have to do this or we won't eat." My heart ached. I wanted to rush forward, wrap my arm around her, promise that everything would be all right. But I knew words wouldn't fix this. Instead, I nodded and said, "Thank you for telling me. I'm so sorry you've been carrying this burden alone." I felt tears prick my own eyes. You shouldn't have to balance work and school by yourself. She looked up at me then, her eyes searching mine. In that instant, years of teacher-student roles blurred. I was no longer simply her instructor. I was a fellow human being, witnessing her struggle. She blinked, as if surprised by my sincerity, and whispered, "I don't want charity." Her voice was fierce, proud. I don't want people feeling sorry for me." I understood. No one wanted pity. What she needed was real support. I said softly, "I'm not here to pity you. I'm here because I care. I want to help if you'll let me." I hesitated, then added, "Let's figure something out together." She looked at me for a long moment, and though her eyes were guarded, her shoulders seemed to relax just a little. I stayed for a few more minutes. I helped her stack the last of the trays and then turned off the dishwasher. I offered to buy her a drink, anything she wanted on the house. She chose a hot chocolate, something she hadn't had in weeks. As I handed it to her, our hands brushed, and I felt a spark of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of a real conversation, of genuine understanding. Walking back through the cafe toward the door, I felt both lighter and heavier at once. Lighter, that I finally knew part of her story. Heavier because I realized the depth of her hardship. Outside, the evening sky had turned to shades of indigo. I took a deep breath, the cool air filling my lungs, and made a silent promise. I would not abandon her now that I had seen the reality behind her silence. I would fight for her, within these walls and beyond them, so that her spark, dimmed by necessity, might one day shine brightly again. Chapter 5. Confronting assumptions. I still remember the moment I realized how wrong I had been. It happened the afternoon after I first saw Zoe behind the counter at Mrs. Patel's cafe. I had come to check on her, thinking she might be skipping class. Instead, I found her carrying tray after tray of coffee cups, her shoulders stooped from fatigue, her eyes fixed on the floor. In that instant, I felt a shock run through me, because I had judged her so harshly, so quickly, without ever pausing to consider what might lie behind her silence. That evening, I sat alone in my living room, the late sunlight slanting through the curtains. Graded papers sat on the coffee table, but I could not bring myself to open them. Instead, I closed my eyes and replayed our first conversation in class when her grades slipped. I had said, "Zoe, you're brilliant. Why aren't you trying?" My frustration had poured out in words I now regretted. How easily I had branded her unmotivated, lazy, careless. Labels I had no right to apply to a child whose inner world I barely understood. I opened my eyes and reached for a notebook on the side table. I scribbled the word assumption in big letters. Beneath it, I wrote 3 questions. Why did I assume she no longer cared? What stopped me from asking about her life sooner? How can I rebuild her trust? I paused, pen hovering over the paper. The first question struck me hardest. I realized how comfortable it had been to see a dip in her grades as merely a drop in effort. I saw other students' worksheets half finished, and assumed the same. I had forgotten that each blank page could hold a story of struggle, a silent plea for help. I thought back to the day she first asked about Frost's eternal summer. She had leaned forward, eyes bright with curiosity, and asked such a thoughtful question that I still replay it in my mind. Then, in the next lesson, she barely looked at me when I spoke. Her spark had dimmed, but I had responded by turning up my volume and my demands, rather than softening my tone and my questions. My second question, why I had waited so long to ask about her life beyond the classroom, stung even more. I remembered how busy I was with lesson plans, grading, faculty meetings, and chasing the department's latest initiative. In that busyness, I had allowed routine to blind me to her needs. I had seen Zoe's silence as an inconvenience rather than an alarm bell. And yet, I also saw that I had hesitated out of respect for her privacy. But privacy should not become a barrier to compassion. A student's right to confidentiality does not excuse my failure to show basic care. I should have let her know, from the first sign of change, that an ear and a heart were available whenever she was ready. My third question, how to rebuild her trust, became my guide for the coming days. I knew that apologies could help, but only if they were genuine and followed by consistent action. I resolved to speak to her not as a judge, but as a mentor and a friend. The next morning, I arrived at school before sunrise, determined to set things right. I found Zoe in the hallway, leaning against the lockers, her backpack slung over one shoulder. My heart pounded as I approached. I took a steadying breath and said quietly, "Zoe, may I talk with you for a moment?" She looked up, startled, but did not walk away. That small pause felt like an opening. In class, I said some things that came from frustration, not understanding. I began. I told you that you weren't trying, but I see now how unfair that was. I judged you without knowing your story. I'm sorry. Her eyes widened, and for a long second she said nothing. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. I continued. I want you to know that I care about more than your grades. I care about you, about what's happening in your life, about how you're feeling. If you ever want to talk or need extra time on assignments, I hope you'll let me know. I I offered her a small, genuine smile. She stood there, silent, and then quietly said, "Thank you, Mr. Thompson." That thank you felt like a fragile bridge between us. I knew she was still uncertain, still assessing whether she could trust me again. So I vowed to show up every day, consistent, patient, and present. No more assumptions, no more demands without understanding. I would offer her the time and space to share as much or as little as she felt ready. In the days that followed, I made small changes in my teaching. Instead of calling on her first when I saw a blank face, I called on students in rotation, giving Zoe the chance to ease back into participation. I left a sticky note on her desk each morning saying, "You're welcome here, and sometimes you're not alone." I checked with Mrs. Patel about adjusting her cafe hours so she could have one afternoon off for homework. Most importantly, I listened. When she hesitated, I waited. When she spoke, I listened without interrupting. And when she showed the slightest flicker of interest, a raised eyebrow, a quick jot of notes, I praised her effort, not her grades. By confronting my assumptions, I began to rebuild a classroom built on trust rather than performance. I learned that every student's journey is paved with unseen challenges, and that my role was to guide with empathy, not judge with impatience. As I share this chapter with you, remember, the moment we stop assuming and start asking open-hearted questions, we open the door to real understanding and to real change. Chapter 6: Seeking the Truth. I woke before dawn the next morning, driven by the weight of yesterday's discovery. The hallways were silent as I slipped into school, but my mind buzzed with questions. What had I missed about Zoe's home life? How many days had she spent hauling trays instead of turning pages? I knew I needed more than my own observations. I needed to hear her story from someone she trusted outside these walls. After first period, I found myself heading down Maple Street toward Sunrise Cafe again. The sky was pale with early light, and the scent of roasting coffee beans drifted through the air before I even opened the door. Inside, Mrs. Patel stood behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked up in surprise when she saw me. "Mr. Thompson," she said, offering a small, tired smile. "You're early today." I stepped forward, careful not to crowd her space. "Thank you for seeing me. I wanted to ask you about Zoe." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "I'm concerned. She's a wonderful student, but I realize now she's been under an enormous strain outside of class. Could you help me understand what's been happening with her?" Mrs. Patel's face softened, and she nodded. She gestured toward a small table in the corner, and we sat with 2 steaming mugs of coffee between us. For a moment, she just stared at the rim of her cup, as though finding the right words took courage. "She's been working here for months," she began. "When she first came, she told me her mother was having health problems. I didn't pry at first. I knew Zoe was proud and private. But as her shifts piled up, I realized something more serious was going on." I leaned forward. "Her mother? What kind of health problems?" Mrs. Patel closed her eyes briefly. "Her mother, Mrs. Alvarez, was diagnosed with a chronic illness last year. It's gotten worse. She's been in and out of the hospital, and the medical bills are overwhelming. Mrs. Alvarez can't work full-time anymore, so Zoe took it upon herself to help cover rent and groceries. She's balancing school assignments in her head while carrying trays of coffee in her arms." A hollow ache settled in my chest. That must be so hard. I'm sorry she's been shouldering all of that alone. Mrs. Patel sighed. Zoe is strong, but children shouldn't have this kind of burden. I've tried to offer her fewer hours when I could, but she insisted it was her responsibility. She doesn't want to feel like a charity case. I nodded, understanding that fierce pride. I saw that in her eyes yesterday, but she is still a child and she needs support. Did she ever mention school? How she manages homework on those long evenings here? Mrs. Patel shook her head. She does her best. Sometimes, she writes notes on the back of order slips or studies while the dishwasher runs. I've seen her reading by the neon sign after closing, but it's not enough time, and I worry she's too exhausted to learn the way she deserves. I pressed my hands together, the wood grain of the table sharp beneath my fingers. Thank you for telling me. I want to help her find a balance, some way to ease this pressure so she can be a student first and not just a caregiver. Mrs. Patel offered a hopeful look. I'd be grateful for whatever you can do. She respects you, Mr. Thompson. If you approach the school about evening programs or financial aid, she'll listen to you. I left the cafe with a renewed sense of purpose. Zoe's silent sacrifice had become real, and now I had a path to follow. The next stop had to be the school counselor's office. If we could tap into emergency funds or community resources, we might lift at least one weight off Zoe's shoulders. Back on campus, I found the counselor, Mrs. Rivera, in her bright corner office. I explained what I had learned, Zoe's mother's illness, the mounting bills, the late-night cram sessions in a cafe kitchen. Mrs. Rivera's expression turned grave, but her eyes shone with determination. There are grants for families in crisis, she said, and we have a partnership with the community center for after-school tutoring and meals. If Zoe qualifies, We can arrange for her to receive groceries each week and free tutoring sessions right here on campus. That way, she won't lose study time to work, at least not all of it. My heart lifted. That would mean so much. I'll talk to Zoe, gently, about these options. I want her to feel in control of the decision. Mrs. Rivera nodded. She'll appreciate that. She's fiercely independent, but she's also realistic. If you present it as tools she can use, not charity, she may accept. As I walked back to room 204, I felt the weight in my chest shift. For the first time in weeks, I sensed hope threading through my concern. I imagined Zoe's face when I told her her mother could have help paying bills, when I offered her free tutoring to lighten her nightly load, when I told her she didn't have to face this alone. That afternoon, I stood before my class and taught, as usual. But in my heart, I carried Zoe's story with me. Each question I asked, each smile I offered had new meaning. I was no longer just a teacher reading poems. I was an advocate reading a life hidden in plain sight. When the final bell rang, I approached Zoe at her desk. Her eyes were downcast, but I spoke softly. Zoe, I've been talking with Mrs. Patel and Mrs. Rivera. We've found some resources that might help you and your mother, so you won't need to work as many hours. Would you like to hear about them? She looked up, uncertainty in her gaze. I held her notebook gently. You tell me when you're ready. I care about you as a person, not just a student. I'm here, whenever you want to talk. She took a shaky breath, and I saw the first flicker of trust return to her eyes. Okay, she whispered. I'm ready. In that moment, the truth I had sought became a bridge, one built on honesty, compassion, and action. And as I prepared to share the possible solutions with Zoe, I realized that seeking the truth is only half the journey. The other half is using that truth to heal. Chapter 7. A Plan to Lend a Hand. I woke the next morning with a clear purpose: to turn my new understanding of Zoe's situation into real support. As I walked through the quiet halls toward room 204, I mentally rehearsed the conversation I would have with Mrs. Patel, the cafe owner, and with Mrs. Rivera, our school counselor. I knew they both wanted to help. Now, it was time to bring them together. First, I met Mrs. Patel at Sunrise Cafe just after opening time. The bell chimed softly as I stepped inside, and the familiar scent of coffee and warm pastries greeted me. Zoe was already behind the counter, wiping down tables with slow, precise movements. When she saw me, her eyes flickered with worry. Perhaps she feared I had come to scold her again. Instead, I smiled and spoke gently. Good morning, Mrs. Patel, I said, extending my hand. Thank you for meeting with me. She set down her cloth and wiped her hands on her apron. Of course, Mr. Thompson. What can I do? I motioned toward Zoe, who was returning mugs to the shelf. I want to work with you to adjust Zoe's schedule so she can focus on school. She's been shouldering too much and it's affecting her health and her studies. Mrs. Patel's expression softened. I've tried to lighten her shifts, but she always refuses any change. She doesn't want to feel like she's asking for special treatment. I understand her pride, I said, but she's a student first. Let's reframe it. Instead of reducing her hours, let's formalize a student-worker agreement. We'll set her schedule in writing. 2 afternoons for work, 2 afternoons for tutoring and study halls, and I'll follow up weekly to make sure she's keeping up with both. She nodded slowly. That could work. If it's an official arrangement, Zoe might accept. And if you can share that agreement with me, I can enforce it here. Thank you, I said. I'll draft the agreement today and bring it by. I'll also involve Mrs. Rivera at the school so that the study hall hours are guaranteed. We shook hands, and I felt a surge of relief. One piece of the plan was in place. Next, I hurried down the street to the school's counseling office, clutching my notebook. Mrs. Rivera welcomed me with a warm smile. I was expecting you, she said. I took a seat and explained the proposed agreement with Sunrise Cafe. If we can guarantee Zoe 2 afternoons of tutoring and 1 afternoon of study hall each week, she'll only need to work twice a week. She'll still contribute, but she'll also have breathing room for homework and rest. Mrs. Rivera considered this, then said, We can arrange that. I'll assign her to our after-school tutoring program on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 3:30 to 5, and block off Wednesdays for the study hall in the library. I'll update her schedule in the system so her teachers know, and we can notify Mrs. Patel of those hours. I smiled, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders. Perfect. And I'll bring the cafe agreement by this afternoon so she sees that it's official. Excellent, Mrs. Rivera said. Is there anything else we can offer right now? I hesitated, then said, Yes. I'd like to set up a weekly check-in with Zoe. Just 5 minutes after school on Fridays. Somewhere private, maybe your office, where she can share how she's doing. No tests, no pressure, just a conversation. Mrs. Rivera's eyes lit up. That's a great idea. I'll clear my Friday morning schedule. She'll appreciate having a reliable time to talk. With those details in place, I left the office, feeling hopeful. The pieces were coming together. A formal work-study balance, scheduled tutoring, and dedicated emotional support. That afternoon, I returned to Sunrise Cafe with the draft agreement. Zoe was stacking plates behind the counter. When Mrs. Patel and I walked in, we asked her to join us at a small table in the corner. I slid the agreement across to her. A simple form listing her 2 work shifts on Monday and Friday from 4 to 6 p.m., 2 tutoring sessions on Tuesday and Thursday from 3:30 to 5 p.m., and a Wednesday study hall from 4 to 5 p.m. I spoke softly. "Zoe, you told me you needed to help at home. We respect that. But we also want you to succeed in school. This agreement lets you keep working and gives you guaranteed time to study and rest. Will you sign it?" She picked up the pen with trembling fingers and studied the paper. Her eyes darted between Mrs. Patel and me. After a long pause, she wrote her name at the bottom. The simplicity of that signature filled me with joy and relief. I thanked her and Mrs. Patel, and we shared a warm cup of hot chocolate on the house, an early celebration of a new beginning. Back at school the next day, I announced quietly to my class that I would be holding extra help sessions on Wednesdays, open to anyone who needed time and space. The other students expressed gratitude, but my focus was on finding Zoe in the room. She caught my eye, offered a shy smile, and mouthed, "Thank you." That moment reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place. In the days that followed, I watched Zoe's spark begin to flicker back to life. She arrived on time for tutoring, book in hand. She stayed after school quietly, working through assignments with a steady focus I hadn't seen in weeks. On Fridays, she and Mrs. Rivera sat together in the counseling office, speaking in low tones. Occasionally, I peeked in and saw Zoe nodding, her posture a little straighter. I realized that a plan, no matter how carefully crafted, only works if you follow through. So I made it my mission to check in each week, not just with Zoe, but with Mrs. Patel and Mrs. Rivera. I wanted to ensure the plan remained effective and that Zoe never felt alone again. By lending a hand in this structured way, we weren't only helping Zoe manage her time. We were sending her a powerful message. Her community cared about her well-being, her dreams, and her potential. And in that care, her spark began to glow once more. Chapter 8. A Fragile Rebound. I arrived at school early on Monday, heart fluttering with cautious hope. The halls were quiet, lit only by the soft glow of corridor lights, and I made my way to room 204 with a sense of purpose. Today marked the beginning of our new schedule. Zoe's first tutoring session after her reduced cafe hours and her first official study hall in the library. I set out a fresh stack of sonnet packets on my desk and prepared my lesson notes, then settled at my own desk to wait. At precisely 3:30 p.m., Zoe slipped into the empty classroom, clutching a well-worn notebook and a pen. She sat at the front table, her posture still a little guarded, but there was a spark in her eyes I hadn't seen in weeks. I greeted her with a warm smile and said, Welcome back. Let's take it slow today, whatever you feel ready to tackle. She opened her notebook and showed me the assignment she'd tried to finish on Wednesday study hall, an analysis of imagery in a Frost poem. Only the first stanza was annotated, but the margin notes were thoughtful. Symbol of warmth versus cold, everlasting summer, hope. Even this small progress filled me with relief. I nodded and said, "Great start. Let's build on this. Together." Over the next hour, we worked through that first stanza, line by line. When she paused for a moment, pen hovering over the page, I resisted the urge to fill the silence. Instead, I asked gently, "What stands out to you here?" And she responded, "The contrast. It feels like the poet is saying hope can outlast hardship." Her voice was soft but sure. I pointed out a word she might explore further, and she wrote it down carefully. We discussed how that single image connected to her own life, how Zoe had found enough hope to keep showing up, despite everything. She looked at me with a small, genuine smile and said, "Thank you for helping me see that." By the end of the session, she had completed her annotations on the first stanza and drafted an outline for the rest of the poem. I gathered our notes and said, "You did incredible work today. Remember, these steps add up." She packed her notebook away and left with a shy wave. The next morning, I entered the classroom to find Zoe already seated, notebook open. She raised her hand when I asked if anyone wanted to share an insight about the day's short story. Her voice quavered at first. I noticed how the main character kept trying, even when things got hard. But as she spoke, it gained confidence. Her classmates listened, and when she finished, several nodded in agreement. That moment of participation felt like a small bridge rebuilt between her and the class. Yet, by Wednesday afternoon, the fragility of her rebound became clear. I peeked into the library during her study hall and saw Zoe leaning her head on her. Hand, eyes closed. Books were spread out around her, but she looked exhausted. I gently knocked and asked if she was all right. She opened her eyes, blinked, and whispered, "Just tired." I nodded and said, "Take a short break. You've earned it." She closed her eyes again and I slipped away, leaving her some space. That evening, I stayed late to grade papers. The silence of the empty school was comforting, but I worried about Zoe's balance. Had we taken too much off her plate, only to risk burnout in another way? Her smile in class was encouraging, but exhaustion still lingered in her movements. When Friday arrived, I met her in Mrs. Rivera's office for our weekly check-in. Mrs. Rivera offered us 2 chairs and a box of tissues, just in case. I asked Zoe how she felt about tutoring, about study hall, about managing schoolwork alongside her family responsibilities. She sighed and said, "It's better. I can do my homework here instead of on my phone during slow cafe moments. But I'm still scared. What if I fall behind again?" Her voice trembled, and I realized how real that fear was. I leaned forward and said, "You're making progress, Zoe. If 1 week feels hard, that's okay. We'll adjust. Do you need more tutoring time or maybe fewer assignments next week?" She thought for a moment, then said, "Maybe 1 more hour of study hall? Just 1 extra hour." Mrs. Rivera and I exchanged a look and agreed to add an extra hour on Thursday afternoons. Zoe's relief was visible. Her shoulders relaxed, and she managed a genuine smile. "Thank you," she whispered. Over the following days, I saw Zoe's work deepen. In literature class, she wrote a paragraph analyzing a character's motivation. In vocabulary exercises, she scored several words perfectly. She handed in her first full poem annotation on time, and I left a note. "Well done. Your insights shine." Each little success built her confidence, even as her tread remained cautious. Still, some days she arrived looking tired, and I made a point to ask if she'd had enough sleep or if she needed to swap a tutoring session for rest. Sometimes she declined, eager to persevere. Other times she accepted. We found a balance, a fragile one, but one that allowed her to breathe. By the end of Chapter 8, Zoe was not fully restored. That would take time, but the glow in her eyes had returned. Her resilience shone through her tentative steps forward. I learned that progress is rarely linear. It can flicker, waver, and falter. But each small victory, an attended session, a raised hand, an on-time assignment, was a thread in a tapestry of recovery. As I prepare to tell you the next chapter, remember that a fragile rebound still counts. The courage it takes to keep trying, even when the path isn't smooth, is itself a triumph. And in celebrating every step, no matter how small, we light the way forward. Chapter 9. New Challenges. Surface. I arrived at school on Monday morning with a sense of optimism. Zoe had seemed more engaged in class. Her notes were more thorough, and she'd even shared a thoughtful observation about our short story. But as I made my way down the hall toward room 204, I noticed her lingering near the lockers, shoulders drawn in. The spark I'd seen last week was dim again. I paused beside her. "Morning, Zoe," I said gently. She forced a small smile, but didn't meet my eyes. "Ready for today's lesson?" She nodded, but the nod felt heavy. I wondered if something new had happened, In class, we began our discussion of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, exploring the theme of responsibility. I asked the students to consider how the creature's creator, Victor Frankenstein, struggles under the weight of his own actions. As hands went up, I searched for Zoe's thoughtful expression, but saw only a distant gaze. She didn't volunteer. When I passed her desk, her notebook was closed, and her pen lay untouched. After class, I slipped into the empty room to check her notebook. Inside, I found only half-finished vocabulary definitions and a single sentence, "I can't keep up." My heart sank. Clearly, something had shifted again. Later that afternoon, during her study hall in the library, I looked for her among the stacks. I found her at the far end table, head resting on folded arms, books scattered around. I crouched beside her and asked softly, "Zoe, are you okay?" She lifted her head slowly, eyes red-rimmed. I thought I could handle it," she whispered. "But yesterday Mom got laid off." My breath caught. "Laid off?" I repeated. She nodded, tears falling. "The cafe changed owners last week. They said they couldn't keep her on now that business is slow. She tried to find another job, but no luck." In that moment, I saw why Zoe's rebound had faltered. Her mother's illness had placed them in financial peril, but at least with the cafe, there had been some income. Now, with her mother out of work again, Zoe's burden doubled overnight. I pulled a chair beside her. "I'm so sorry, Zoe. That's a lot to carry." She nodded, hugging herself. "I don't know what to do. If I miss work, we won't pay rent. If I miss school, I'll fall behind again." I reached out and placed my hand gently on hers. "You won't have to choose. We'll figure this out together." That evening, I stayed late in my classroom, making phone calls. First, I spoke with Mrs. Patel, who confirmed that the cafe's new management was in flux and that Zoe's mother had indeed lost her position. She offered to speak to the owner and request a part-time role for Mrs. Alvarez, just a few hours a week to help bridge the gap. Then I called Mrs. Rivera to arrange emergency food assistance from the community center and asked our administration if we could tap into a hardship grant to help cover rent for a month. By the next morning, I had a rough plan. Mrs. Alvarez would return to the cafe for 2 weekend shifts. Zoe's work shifts would remain 2 afternoons a week. The school would provide grocery vouchers, and we would apply for a small rent subsidy from a local nonprofit. The details weren't finalized, but at least there was a path forward. I caught Zoe before her first period English class. She looked apprehensive as I handed her a small envelope. "This is a voucher you can use at the campus pantry for groceries," I said. "Mrs. Rivera helped secure it." I paused. "And I'm talking with the cafe. Your mom might be able to work weekends again. Her eyes flickered between hope and doubt. Really? She whispered. Really, I assured her. We're all on your team. She tucked the envelope into her bag and managed a small, grateful smile. Thank you, she said. And for a moment, I saw a glimmer of her old light. That afternoon, I observed Zoe in tutoring. She was quieter than last week, but she still opened her textbook and worked through problems. I didn't push her too hard. Instead, I offered gentle guidance and reminded her that any progress was worth celebrating. By Thursday, Mrs. Patel confirmed that Zoe's mother could work limited weekend hours, enough to cover basic expenses, and the school's grant committee had approved a one-time rent subsidy. Suddenly, the weight on Zoe's shoulders lifted just enough for her to breathe without collapsing. But amid these good developments, a new challenge surfaced. During Friday's check-in with me and Mrs. Rivera, Zoe confessed that the stress had taken a toll on her friendships. She admitted she'd stopped going to club meetings and lunch with friends because she was too busy or too tired. I feel isolated, she said softly, like I don't belong anywhere but work and school. I realized then that academic support and financial aid, while essential, weren't enough. Zoe needed connection and a sense of normalcy. She needed community. So we added another piece to our plan. I approached the drama teacher, who agreed to let Zoe join rehearsals on Tuesdays, simply as an observer at first. No lines or lines to memorize, just to sit with peers and be part of something fun. And Mrs. Rivera arranged for 2 of Zoe's classmates to invite her to lunch so she wouldn't eat alone. Small steps, but vital ones. By the end of the week, Zoe showed signs of life returning to her eyes. She laughed softly when the drama teacher called her name and welcomed her to watch. She accepted her friends' invitations to lunch, sitting with them and exchanging smiles. Her pen moved across worksheets, and although her posture was still cautious, she seemed more relaxed. When I caught her before leaving school on Friday, she said quietly, "Thank you for everything." And I realized that new challenges would continue to appear. Life isn't static, and support must evolve with each change. But in that moment, I saw how a network of caring adults, teachers, counselors, neighbors, could help a young person navigate each fresh storm. Chapter 9 taught me that progress is never permanent, but resilience can be renewed. And that, no matter how many challenges surface, we can face them one by one together. Chapter 10 Empathy and Lasting Change. I never imagined that teaching Zoe would teach me as much as it taught her. By the time spring arrived, the corridors of our school felt different, warmer, more alive. I walked to room 204 each morning with a renewed sense of purpose, carrying the lessons of patience, compassion, and community that Zoe's journey had shown me. That final week of classes, I paused in my lesson plan to address the whole class. Today, I said, we're going to do something a little different. I want us to reflect on how we see one another, not just as students and teachers, but as people with stories we may never know. I asked everyone to turn to a partner and share one moment when someone offered them unexpected help or kindness. The room filled with soft voices, a friend who lent notes when they were sick, a coach who stayed late to help with practice, a sibling who comforted them after a bad day. When it was Zoe's turn, she hesitated, then looked at me. With a small, steady voice, she said, "Mr. Thompson helped me when I thought I had to do everything alone. He listened, and he didn't judge me. He gave me a chance to breathe." My heart swelled. The room grew quiet in respect, and I felt tears prick my eyes. After that lesson, I knew it was time to ensure the changes we made for Zoe would last, not by one person's effort, but by creating a culture of empathy in our school. I met with the principal and proposed a student support network. A small team of teachers, counselors, and community partners who would check in regularly with any student showing signs of struggle, academic, emotional, or financial. The principal agreed, and within days, Mrs. Rivera, Mrs. Patel, and I became the founding members of this network. Our first task was to train teachers to notice red flags: a sudden drop in participation, closed notebooks, tired eyes. We shared Zoe's story anonymously, focusing on the turning point, how a simple moment of understanding changed everything. Then we set up a protocol. Whenever a teacher noticed a student in distress, they could refer them to the network for prompt support. We gathered resources, tutoring programs, meal vouchers, emergency grants, and community mentorships. Meanwhile, I watched Zoe flourish. She still worked part-time at the cafe, but her schedule was balanced. Her mother's health had stabilized thanks to community resources, and her weekend shifts provided just enough income. Zoe joined the drama club as a full member, not just an observer, and took on a small speaking role in the spring play. She invited her classmates to study together in the library, and laughter often echoed down that corridor. On the last day of term, I found Zoe in the empty classroom after everyone else had left. She held a small envelope and looked up at me with a grin. "I wanted to thank you," she said. Inside the envelope was a simple handmade card. On the front, a drawing of an open book and a steaming mug of hot chocolate. Inside, scribbled words, "For all the chapters we've written together." My eyes stung as I thanked her. I realized then that empathy doesn't end with a single act. It grows, spreads, and builds structures that last. By listening to Zoe, advocating for her, and creating a support network, we changed not only her story, but the story of our entire school community. As the classroom lights dimmed for one last time, I walked to the window and looked out at the playground where students played under cherry blossoms. I thought of every silent student whose struggles were hidden behind closed notebooks and tired faces, and I knew our work was not over, but it had only just begun. To you watching this video, remember, behind every student is a story waiting to be heard. When we replace judgment with empathy, assumptions with questions, and distance with support, we don't just teach lessons in literature or math. We teach lessons in humanity. And those lessons, carried forward, become the true legacy of any teacher, any mentor, and any caring community. Great work today. Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.